So yeah,
AFK
while I
done?
was waiting for you, I just went to go and grab a coffee across the street. Um, so I like Belleville because there's an Ethiopian cafe across the street. My buy is here across the street, and from my buy I get like a decent cappuccino at 15 rand, and I get ambasha, which is a type of Ethiopian flatbread, but it's like a sweet bread and like other sorts of things as well. My Ethiopian friend across the street now makes a decent chai latte at 15 rand. At 15 rand. So so this is what it looks like when you can get a decent cup of coffee from a person of color. They only charge you 15 rand, like it's a proper cappuccino. So now we ask the question, about gentrification and right to the city and accessibility and alle ander goed. I'm actually looking for the chat function here. I want to see what chat is saying. No, for real. I mean, this is what happens when people of color are, trying to make things accessible. Um, I think accessibility is also perhaps a good segue into our conversation. Um, I will say that this whole idea, because we're revisiting things now, no? By way of introduction, today we are having a conversation about the Mapungubwe Prototype Group, which is a project under the New Patterns umbrella of the African Fashion Research Institute's educational interventions. I am joined in the background by our colleague Siviwe James, who is running tech today. Um, Siviwe is the creator of the Fold podcast and is also a senior researcher at the African Fashion Research Institute. And her interest in today's conversation is that she influences programming in the African Fashion Research Institute related to audio outputs and also how conversations develop when considering indigenous media in relation to those digital platforms. Um, the conversation will be held between myself, Scott Eric Williams, previous senior educator and curator with the African Fashion Research Institute. Um, uh, as is often the case with these small organizations, I fulfilled a role as jack of all trades, um, facilitating work on the website, educational programs, project management across different projects. I also function as an artist, working in weaving, zines, and wheat paste, which I consider to be fibrous praxis that fits into the ambit of broader fashion researchers. And then I'm also joined today by my colleague Bongani Tao, um, who is, I think it's necessary to retrace our steps a little bit. Bongani Tao is a researcher behind the Davidton 1520 Instagram platform, which we can consider alternative ways of thinking about research. It's quite a rigorous platform. Bongani's influence is in township studies and how the fashioning of the self occurs in urban black spaces, with an interest in the history, the fashion, the culture, across various facets in the township of Davidton. And Bongani is the impetus behind the research on Davidton that happens within the African Fashion Research Institute. So I think that's quite an important statement because there's been a lot of research on the African Fashion Research Institute that's been coming out of that's been developed on Davidton, and none of that research could exist without the research or the formative research and foundation that Bongani Tao has laid. It's also essential that we talk about those things because we also consider the role that fledgling researchers are playing in the development of knowledge for us and by us coming from the African continent and decentering Western and European narratives about what fashion education and fashion knowledge is. With that said, Bongani, we've worked together for a while, and we were both participants and co-learners, co-producers in two projects in particular developed by the African Fashion Research Institute. The first one being the Fold Residency, which was a residency that considered the dual relationships um, of South Africa and Kampala to the bark cloth, which is a product of the Lugubu tree, if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yes.
And right, and then we were
Olubogu,
all
yes. Yes.
say again.
Olubogu, yes.
Okay. And
Yes.
then we were also co-participants in the Mapungubwe prototype group residency as well.
Yes.
Bongani, recently you participated in a fashion education program. Could you please tell us a little bit about that?
So I went to PXL Med, well, that means Media Arts and Design, in Belgium. And for that, I was invited by the head of graphic design, who is Johan von der Bosch, and the director of the institution itself, Dirk Reinders. Sorry, I'm sorry if I'm butchering the surname. But what I think they had noticed and sort of seen with a lot of the work that I do was, firstly, I guess, like my multidisciplinary approach to research, how I'm thinking about archives and archives in Davidson, but how I'm also using fashion to sort of think about Davidson, and fashion's role in Davidson. First as uniform coming behind to domesticate or quote unquote civilize, and then sort of where the transition from uniforms to where people started using fashion to access ideas, but use fashion as well to start thinking broader than the confines, the constraints, the labels, being contained in a space. And sort of how that then started influencing the psyche of the place, and sort of all the ideas and sort of not subcultures, because I mean, we'd have to assume there's a main culture, which I don't think there is, because also time is sort of, broad, and things have always been happening everywhere at the same time. So they wanted me to bring some of that thinking. So I started first looking at fashion specifically within the township, and then I started broadening to thinking about it from a design perspective. And design, as it shows up, is in the architecture of the place. Then obviously, what people wear, um, and then the design of language itself. So sociologically, some of the papers that I've been studying have helped me understand that people came and they decided which one is the lingua franca, and sort of also that sort of control, right, exercised in that way. And what I'm seeing from using design as a way of thinking is how all of these sort of elements, which live in different disciplines, have all contributed to this civilization mission. And that civilization mission obviously sitting squarely on the shoulders of black people in this country, to domesticate them, but also to keep them in a more or less permanent state of convulsion. I think Achille Mbebe articulates that very well. But I think also what fashion does, which is what I started exploring with the students, is it also helps us think about the history of the place, history as embodied cultures that have come and gone, and that still exist and that still influence, but as well what we wear says about what we value and who we are. And that's, I think that's the sweet spot for me, because obviously my study sort of looks at both the worlds of like the things that we don't like talking about and the things that we can talk about. But I think for the students, it was more important to think about fashion as what holds more than bodies, but what holds memory. And then so they used fashion to access some of the memories from their past, from their cultures. It was a mixed group of kids from everywhere in the world. I think that's the benefit of Europe. It's that because they have institutions that attract people from around the world. You sort of, when you come into the institution, you find like it's a melting pot of so many different cultures. Some students were coming into understanding the 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 aesthetics, the things that form and shape their identities for somewhat the first time, like in a real sense, because some of them have had to be cosmopolitan people and like people of the world. A lot of them hadn't set with some of these ideas that have formed the identities of the places that they come from, which I think it's also like a benefit because sometimes it's easy for people to stay in one place and do the same thing over and over again. But I think it's at the heart of it was seeing them go into the places of birth, their townships, their villages, and find the things that remind them of a sense of who they are beyond sort of what has been dictated to us as a world in this globalized world of like who we need to be and things like that. And then they had to use Photoshop. They had to use actually like the whole Adobe suite to actually bring sketches and doodles and fonts that they create with crayons, with charcoal, and integrate them into and bring them into the digital sphere to sort of tell this complex story of you see the garments, you see the fonts that they've created, like the personality of them coming through, but also then there's the text that sort of carries the message that they wanted to sort of carry across. And this obviously contributes to my broader than research interests of looking at what aesthetics, what fabrics, how we fashion ourselves in the world in general sort of says about who we are and what we value.
Okay, so but I think that within the culture of AFRI, we've always preached this gospel of mentorship and transfer of knowledge throughout our relationships with AFRI core family and even AFRI extended cohort as well. So you've now gone from researcher to educational program participant to educator. You've now gone into that position of educator. When you compare these different modalities of education, if you think about the environment at PXL where you were teaching, and also when you think about the African Fashion Researchers FOLD program and its structure with, let's say, for instance, Lasiba Mabitsela as a head educator of that program, and the Mapungubwe prototype group experience, which was a lot more organic in nature. What has your experience been of the difference in those forms of education? And how would you say that your experience of those three environments has influenced your approach to research with an educational output currently? What's your take on that?
I think when you step into an organization that sort of has a standing tradition, there's a sense and a level of like upholding, that you kind of have to embody, where there are structures and there's ways of teaching and learning, and there's ways of like transferring knowledge, and it's set up in a particular way, which I think is like, in some sense, what sort of the old and it kind of represents the old world of like hierarchy, of less fluidity and flexibility, and less thinking sort of outside the box. And when I say the box, I don't mean that like knowledge can ever be finite, but there's a way of thinking that sort of always gears towards a particular direction, right? Because there are frameworks that sort of hold things in place. And with AFRI, what I've experienced is I've been able to tap into different mentors that have experience sort of in different ways of teaching. Yes, So from conversations, from the links that I get when we're on the field and we're doing the actual work, feedback and response, after certain works, but also knowing that you are also surrounded by people that are interested in holding space, that sees you for how you want to show up and how you actually show up, and want to support and grow that. Which I think in a lot of instances, in some more established and sort of traditional spaces, that's not really there, because I think we don't even need to get into Pierre Bourdieu to understand fundamentally that, like, there's so many things that are ingrained in us and how we see each other. The images, like how we see each other, how we experience each other, that in some way, shape, or form help us sort of push each other out sometimes, or leave each other out sometimes. It's in the language, it's in the semantics, it's in how we think we are better than maybe, or progressed, or more educated, and those things sort of kind of become sort of ingrained in us. And sometimes we uphold these things that are essentially, and I think if I were to sum it up, like gatekeeping sort of mechanisms. Those are the things that sort of keep a lot of willing, interested people with love and heart from, accessing knowledge, but also accessing ways of developing, but also of being future developers. And I think AFRI broke down that mold. And I think with Mapungu, where that was the first time I could actually not have to perform, just to learn and ask questions as a human being, and to explore. And I think research is most powerful when we're vulnerable, when we're real, when we're human, when we're curious in real time. And in a lot of instances and in a lot of places, because there are time pressures, there's a lot of things. People sometimes dismiss even that mere curiosity. Um, and we have to move, we have to do it this way. No, there's a way of doing that, there's a way of articulating that, there's a way of there was none of that. So we could actually sit with questions and we could let things bother us. One of my mentors within the organization has said that it's very powerful when you can sit with a problem. Like, a lot of people don't have the bandwidth to sit with the problem. Like, let something trouble you. So we were building it, we were thinking about it, and we were making it at the same time, which I think that's like a multi-dimensional way of developing a person, because they have to think like a researcher, but also they have to think like a human being. They have to just imagine, but also they have to think about what are we making, and use that consciousness to sort of, inspire themselves to do something and make something.
Yeah.
And I think creativity thrives in environments like that.
Sure. So having this this these multiple points of entry where you are educator, co-learner, participant at the same time, you are also now involved in the process of compiling workbooks, which are educational resources where we try to transfer these different observations and gleanings to broader audiences where the educational process can happen in our absence. How does that multi-pronged understanding of the approach help you to think about how information comes into the workbook, or how the different parts fit together in the learning guide or the learning resource, and understanding which parts of the process and which bits of knowledge to extract to impart the principle that will be contained in the workbook?
So how are we deciding about what forms part of the workbook and captures the essence of what we wanted to create?
Yeah, especially since this is an educational development, or an educational resource that is influenced by the let's say, for instance, the reflections and observations of multiple parties, right? There are these different voices coming into the Davidson guide. There are these different voices coming into the Fold guide, and there are these different voices coming into the Mapungubwe guide. And I feel like you are part of all three of those processes. So how does that influence how you see, not the global process, how you see which information should be selected, or the photos, the songs, the objects, and how those become teachable material for the learning guides?
I think I was listening to a talk. No, actually, I was reading a book by Adam Grant, who is thinking about no, actually, it's the philosophy of design. The book is the politics of design. Yes, the politics of design. Within the politics of design, design as a discipline sort of has principles like colors work a certain way, but all of those principles have been formed on knowledges. There were certain parts of the world that the global north sort of went to and learned how colors work. There were certain parts where they learned how typography works. There were certain parts. So I think having that sort of in the back of my mind now that I've read what I've read, I think the spaces we have been in have their own sort of unique contribution to disciplines if we are still maintaining sort of this status quo of how we teach,
Mm,
or just knowledges then in general, that can help the public. To be more specific, let's talk about the Mapungube project. In the Mapungube project, we saw the tension between what happens when cultures are compressed. Like, we live in a world that takes big things and sort of makes them these small symbols that are passed around, where at some point they start losing meaning completely, right? But because we were there, and there are people that come from there that have a knowing and have a recorded knowing, of that place and what it used to be and what it should be known for. They were able to give us access to knowledge that made me realize that even before Gregor Mendeleev, which I was taught in chemistry, came up with the periodic table, there were people who knew melting points and boiling points of elements. There were people who knew how to melt things, how to create ornaments, how to work with different elements. And this is science, but this is science that we somewhat dismiss because it sort of doesn't
right.
follow, or is not held, or formulated in a particular way that it feels like it can be education. So with Davidson in particular, I know that with Davidson, what has been really interesting is fashion here has always been a technology of survival. Placelo, for instance, like it looks like a simple piece of cloth, but this is a person who works at the mines, who has been stripped. In Alf Kumalo's images in the archives, we see them being stripped, being hose piped. That's the environment. Everything has been taken from them. So the only thing that they can hold on to is they can try and take these utility garments and put ornaments on them, such that when they adorn those ornaments, they start to embody a spirit that connects to their vitality. And their
Right.
vitality is traditions, as practices from the past or from even the present, because even time for us means a very different thing, right?
Yeah.
And now all of a sudden people are able to survive the most craziest of situations, and they're able to bear the moment. And that's fashion, because these had to be embodied. When you look at the Bex culture took place on Iceland streets. I met the monumental Victor Ndlazulwane. Victor Ndlazulwane was one of the diligent ones, because friends are hosting an event for the arts. They're trying to resuscitate the art movement within the environment. Iceland Street was where Bex culture took place. And these were a group of young kids who grew up in an Iceland world where the same Iceland who the street is named after was set very closely with Vervu to say, give me education and I'll show you how Bantu education can domesticate them. Put me in a room with the architects, and we'll find a way to create boxes small enough to contain the mind, to contain the movement, and to sort of convince them that that's the space that they need to be held by. But the youth went out on that same street, and this also, I think, what makes it profound for me is no one told this history to them. I'm coming across it as I am looking, and I'm trying to find things, that they performed it there. And I think for me it was a psychological reversal, because when they started doing that, they started also accessing other ideas outside of the ideas that were supposed to contain them. And they would start to think about themselves in a broader sense of what is their place in the world. And that's the whole point of Black people accessing Joburg, which used to be a safe haven where they were sort of castrated out of, but that was built from gold, which was being mined by them. That they couldn't access those ideas. They couldn't access the cosmopolitanism, all the knowledge that comes from around the world, which people had access to when we were living in states where coloniality didn't determine that.
Yeah. I think your point about the psychological reversal is important, Bongani. You referred to Achille Mbembe and his reference to the convulsive state. And something that came up in one of the Zine workshops recently was this concept of trauma that is induced by coloniality. And the expectation from or the expectation of Black creators to be centering decoloniality. But I sometimes feel that in this conversation about decoloniality, that we are actually reperforming that trauma. So if we think about the psychological reversal that you're referring to, how do we work in the educational space? If we are thinking about the psychological reversal as a process of recovery from coloniality, is that like a post-colonial conversation, or are we working with a different set of concepts here, Bongani?
Please say that again.
So yeah, we went deep in. So
my English bundles are depleted. It's the weekend.
hey, they are running out. But yeah, let me backtrack a little bit. You used Achille Mbembe's concept of a state of convulsion, right? So
Yes.
people of color or colonial subjects are expected to remain in a position of convulsion, right? According to Mbembe's reference. But we are also dealing with a process of decoloniality that you have just referred to as a psychological reversal. Bear with me. So if we are thinking of the trauma that coloniality produced in us, how do we proceed beyond centering that trauma of coloniality if we are now in a place of recovery? It's a psychological reversal, right? So we're thinking about the process of recovery. So what process of recovery are we referring to that we are doing in this fashion conversation? Are we talking about post-coloniality, which comes with its own issues, but we use it as a catch-all term? Or are we thinking about different concepts that we can use to move decolonial education forward? What is your
I
take on
think,
that?
Virgil said that, you know, the role of like fashion, like, is always to like question, an existing tradition. Like, that's the usefulness of fashion. So I think my entry point first is like, first, for me, helping people get conscious using fashion about what's happening within the environment, to see that there, there's a design, there's an intention to do something, right? But within that, then I deviate and do the uncomrade thing of, so now how do we then think about from here
The
onward?
uncomrade thing, I like that. Yeah, that's a bar. Go,
So
go.
so it's like, so now how do we move forward? So how are we going to use now fashion to hold ourselves? How are we going to use fashion not to hold like the things that make us sad, but the traditions of abundance. I think it's the traditions of abundance that like I'm holding on to, but also I'm saying we need not also just uphold tradition to just stay as tradition, but we are allowing ourselves to then imagine what we would like to see. Um, I can't remember what series I was watching, but the opening of I think it's "Can't Get You Out of My Head." It was done by BBC, and then they kind of took it off. and they're sort of exploring all the images, ideas, and concepts that have taken over the world and how they infiltrated the world. The opening statement, they had quotes at the beginning of it. And on this one episode, this guy was saying something to the effect of, the world and how we see it today is because someone thought that this is where we needed to come to. And then we agreed. So if we would like to see a different world, obviously we have to design it ourselves. And I think that has been the biggest challenge for all emerging worlds, all worlds that have tried to gain some form of sovereignty, because they've had to untangle themselves from some ideas and from some stations and from some ways of believing, to run away from this notion that when you give a slave power, you're making them dangerous, because if they'll think like a slave, and within that power, they might just destroy things instead of fixing them. So we are dismantling everything that's holding, the Black psyche from healing, from thinking about possibility, from looking outside of this environment, from loving oneself, from the idea of hating oneself, from self-hate,
Okay.
Because that's also taught and sort of indoctrinated into us. Because some of the things we're doing, and I'm taking accountability as well, it's things that were instituted but now upheld. And it's like, so now how do we now start to, deviate from, can we have a Pantula culture that does not praise a person being violent? They can dress a particular way, they can be cosmopolitan in their mindset, they can be hustlers, they can be people that make things happen, but not be violent, and not choose to subscribe to certain things about that mindset, right? Because there's elements about those cultures that work, that help us gain the confidence that when you are born into an environment like this, it's immediately stripped away.
Mm. Yeah, I think your comment that I'd like to latch onto is how do we celebrate a Pansula culture without celebrating violence? Something that's coming up like in WhatsApp. And this is a problem that maybe hip hop has also had for a while.
Yep.
Uh, but I think that's maybe where the question of personal agency comes into this conversation, eh? Where we
Yes.
treat the garment as a portal.
Yes.
If we are thinking as black people and blackness as a concept that bends time and space, and we are thinking of this concept of futurity and possibilities, then when a person like myself shows up to the office in a floppy, you know, or a person like myself shows up to the office while Ndiarafula, we co-opt brands and things, and we show up to the office and we're having a curriculum development meeting, or we are facilitating a workshop in that way. Maybe those are subtle ways in which we disseminate that concept or that
Yes.
possibility. So how do we then, in the vein of a portal or something that fits into this fabric as a technology that makes things visible and makes other things invisible,
Mhm.
as a futuristic technology, uh, what role do you think the learning guide or the workbook can play in disseminating the principle of that possibility, in helping participants to understand, oh snap, this is what I can do with my own site as a situated practice,
Mhm.
where we're not specifically throwing around these monolithic terms like decoloniality, but we're thinking of localized situated practices, that
Yeah.
draw on the personal and give us that sense of value of self. What role do you
Mhm.
think maybe that a workbook or learning guide can play in that sort of role?
I think shifting awareness for me is partly like one of the most foundational things, because there's a way in which we see the world and the way we see ourselves that in a lot of ways, uh, a lot of us don't get to decide up to a certain point, unless you are born within an environment and a family and maybe a community that's sort of aware of sort of all the dynamics that are happening in the world. sometimes a black person will see another black person like a white person, right? And when I say that, I mean that from a perspective of lesser than myself, that perpetuates sort of certain people do not deserve to be human beings. They don't deserve to be a part of, they don't deserve to come into and belong in certain spaces. And that's because of, I think, sometimes like a lack of awareness where we're paying attention to, and we've been paying a lot of attention to the global north. When you think about the idea of fashion shifting from, the quality of the make, what it holds, what it says, which were some of, old African practices,
Mm.
um, to trends where now it's this color this season, and then sort of the north becomes like the center of this attention that we give it. And then it influences, that attention then influences, because we are consumed by their cultures and their movements, that it consumes us and our cultures and our movements. So that shift in focus for me, I think, is foundational. It's like, here's bark cloth. Have you thought about a material that could move from a stem of a tree that you can wrap banana leaves around and it regenerates in 2 weeks? It's sustainable, it's fresh, and there are people within the space who are using it to create actual beautiful garments, but also it's good for the environment. We won't need to
Yeah,
draft big policies and go and meet with our private jets. The things are here, right? Why are we not paying attention to them, instead of going and drafting resolutions? And then I think second to that, it's then decentering this idea of knowledge having a center, of knowledge flowing from
right.
this fountain, saying that other places can't produce knowledge, other places can't hold knowledge, other places don't have knowledge, which is a fallacy, because, much of the world is sustained by all the knowledges, that
Yeah,
are produced everywhere. So I think shifting the focus for one, like when you come into a fashion course, and a lot of people, you learn about certain brands, certain people, certain places, and then you have to sort of spend a lot of time in your career consumed by that, and by assimilating their taste, their style, their sensibility, and their ways of being in the world. Then that's when you kind of get accepted into. Whereas I think the world also, it's what the interesting changes that are happening is that we're starting to see people who are like, no, actually, we are the kids of immigrants. That's real to us. And if you are a sports brand that a lot of people consume, we're going to come with our identity and our culture, which is a culture that they formulated and they have values. And we will create the sneaker. And you're going to give us rights to our patent. And then the culture will benefit from that. And
yeah,
now, all of a sudden, brands are having to meet, cultures, somewhere further, much further
yeah,
than they met them before. Yeah.
yeah. And that goes beyond the narrowness of a diversity policy, for instance, or a diversity department, and maybe even goes beyond, shallow approaches to addressing sustainability, like greenwashing, through
Yes.
the implementation of things like bar cloth. Like, how does one really engage with bar cloth and the cultural practices around that? And are we thinking more broadly about, you know, uh, repatriate, not just repatriation, but maybe what's this conversation? Not retribution. When we think about the return of things and the reclamation of things, what is the word I'm looking for? Restitution. you know,
Yes. Yes.
when we think like the restitution conversation, like actually acknowledging that knowledge is bifurcated and comes from these different tributaries and is feeding into this pool, because it's quite difficult also to separate these things from each other at this point in like human existence.
Mm-hmm.
um
Mm-hmm.
so this is a conversation that you and I could have for a whole week or for a month, but because we are restricted by time and resources, there's only one more question we can ask, which is, we've set ourselves quite a big task. If we're talking about the building of awareness and things, it seems like there's quite a long road, and a, a retracing of steps and backing up, like we've made 2 steps, but now we realize, okay, now we've got to back up 3 because there's more work that needs to be done.
Sure.
It's probably arrogant for an organization, a small organization with a team of like 10 people, to think it will really change anything in fashion education discourse. But maybe this is a good time to refer back to the prompts that I have here. And it goes something like this. If you look honestly at the arc of new patterns as a program now, what shifted for you in your practice or in your understanding of fashion histories, or how you imagine African design futures? How did the project bring into focus things you hadn't seen before? What remains unresolved or still needs working?
Oof. Um, hmm. I think for the most part, it was a shift in understanding that we don't have to subscribe, we don't have to do things a particular way to be considered as something, right? Davidson's history even like sort of articulates that very well. We have, people who went into courts and learned, a little bit of law and learned a little bit of this and learned a little bit of that, to advocate for and help people gain access to knowledge, gain access to things, but as well as ways that will allow them to develop further by looking elsewhere. Because had we been the same people that are looking to the same source, to the same places, to the same sort of places where we're told inspiration comes from, then we would be chained to perpetuating the same ideas and then keeping the same tenets alive. Whereas we are on a different mission of saying there are other principles that exist in other spaces and in other places that are conducive, that are practical, and that are part of the solutions that we're saying we're looking for. They're here now in real time. Because I also genuinely thought that things are going to be fixed elsewhere, and certain people are going to do certain things. Where we are now, and the challenge that we have is that PDFs are still expensive, which means all the information that has come from people who are not considered as educators right now, they've been
Mm,
kept out of that conversation,
mm,
and they can't even buy into it. And now they've been castrated from knowledge that in part their ancestors, their families, their lineages, their DNAs has contributed into making medicine as we know it, physics, everything as we know it. And I'm worried because it means that and we still devalue people, but also at the same time we are upholding the things and the systems that perpetuate that idea, that keep it. So it becomes a perpetual thing. It's almost as if like we can't think, but like we are using big words, we're formulating big ideas, but it's like these things are still here and we're still upholding them. But what is the step further? I think for me then becomes the thing of now I'm also part of that conversation. That's a question I ask myself every single day. What about me? What is my contribution? What am I doing? Right?
mm,
I just put together a website, and the domain for it is madeindavidson.co.za. And within that website, I want to contain the history, the arguments, the cultures, and the cultures are going to show up exactly how they want to show up because I'm not the president of Davidson, and I didn't start any of the work in Davidson also to like lead. I don't think Davidson needs a face. I don't think Davidson needs a leader. A lot of people are leading things. My friends are leading, putting stuff together. It's arduous. You have to the money to make things happen, the time, the coordination, the administration of it. And we need that love. I think we need the love. I look at a lot of the movements that have come before us that has afforded us some of the rights that we have right now and enjoy. And I look at some of those people and I'm like, some of those people didn't have the right resources or the time. Some of them were raising families. It was very difficult for them, but there was a sense of love that they carried with them that helped them tap into an abundance. And
Yeah,
in an abundance that perpetually wanted to see the change sort of come to the fore.
right, right. Bongani, diabulela, diabulela mfondini, intle. This is a two-way conversation. Um, and you and I haven't had much of an opportunity to debrief, so I'm going to abuse the time a little bit and ask if there's anything you'd like to ask me about these different experiences that we haven't had a chance to discuss or chat about as a parting shot.
Looking at what you've written in your master's about rethinking how we teach and learn, and a lot of my learning also comes from that, directly from you. What do you think the future of learning that's going to be like more helpful to kids and that's going to bring in more access? What does that look like for you? Because you've this has troubled you for some time.
Yeah, I think you've raised some important observations already in the conversation that are in tandem with some of the reflections I've had. And for me, that's letting things bother us, allowing the space for us to be troubled, and actually uh, to sit with the discomfort of not knowing and to sit with the discomfort of grappling, especially in a time where tools are available that allow us to access pseudo responses a lot quicker. We really need to harness and to sit with the human issue, quality, ability to grapple with things, and to allow ourselves to let the answers emerge and be content with the fact that sometimes answers don't emerge immediately. Even in reflecting on residencies, when we think about residencies like the Fold, residencies like the Mapungubwe prototype group, um, those reflections or observations come to one afterwards, and these might not be incredibly profound observations, but also what would make a difference in the educational process is understanding that a good educator needs to be patient, um, and needs to allow for agency and for moments of learning to develop. How is that moment of learning created is a critical question for me going forward. And the other important reflection that you just revealed is that we must allow for curiosity to exist. You know, seeing that you've read the thesis, my goat is Paulo Freire, and Paulo Freire said that, at 70, 80 years of age, in his old age, Paulo Freire said, and this is like Madala, ne? Madala is saying there on the video, I am a curious man. For somebody to admit that quality, that childlike innocence in the learning process at such a grand old age is really a beautiful quality that needs to be honest. I mean, your last few days might be here and you imparting knowledge about the educational process and which qualities are important to learning. And you're talking about curiosity, you know? Um, those are important questions for me. Like, how do we harness curiosity? Recently, there was a conversation in the art world about certain people's art practices, art fairs, um, their role in expanding discourse. And one of the people who argued in this conversation said um, that there is no archive. And I thought that was a very odd conversation or an odd thing to say. Like, that's an odd thing to say. Um, because maybe you're looking in the wrong places if you're saying there is no archive. And I want to quote from a recent conversation with a colleague, and a statement from my colleague, who says the following: um, the lack of access and integration of materials within the archive, and our desire to still exist in there. It's almost like we can't think, because the real work isn't about us being visibilized. We become agents, the one who can push a door open or make the place to hold their memories. Um, I think those are important. Those are important comments to harness for the future of education. I mean, when we collapse concepts of time and space, um, it's important to acknowledge that the archive is then, but it's also here, but it's also 10 steps ahead, you know, and thinking about what we draw from, which lessons we can learn, and just providing the space where young people or any of us can realize that, yeah, there's a value to my contribution here, but also what can I get out of this conversation that happens in an educational space. Um, and as forums for technology become increasingly censored and controlled, I think that the educational space, where it's valuable for us, will have to become more and more decentralized. And
Interesting.
I wonder what role universities will continue to play, and if they will continue to play a role, seeing that universities are largely these neoliberalist constructs, you know, like we claim Henry Giroux, but actually the whole thing is a neoliberalist construct. Um, so I think that the small moves that some of these interventions are making are quite important, and maybe, you know, those moments where you are having a learning experience with 10 people instead of 50 is the more important one, you know,
Yes.
where these more intimate conversations can be developed, and maybe even where it's three young men, you know, in Guyani, walking
Yes,
through
yes.
walking through the
Scott,
Tsonga Kraal, you know.
Scott, some of the private institutions thrive because there's less kids that they can use colors and all these different symbols to study them to the core to understand what they respond to. And I think that's the level of understanding of a human being that needs to be there for flow of information to like go back and forth. And I think the more intimate the crowd, that energy is not filtered anywhere, you know. And I think with that said, I realized that another thing I had to learn from you, like, and what I'd like to ask is how do you think about discipline, and what role does that play in your praxis, and so that my generation that has AI that doesn't have to think about doing crossword puzzles in a magazine, and actually like instill the fundamentals that sort of hold a person together, the more tests they sort of have to have as they go. Well, how do you think about discipline, and how does it sort of how does it show up in your praxis?
You said something about the numbers now, the numbers of people in a classroom, but I think going beyond numbers, it's also about the motivations at the root of education. Um, so, so particularly in resistance movements across the globe, where the zeitgeist was happening, like these resistances after 1950 in particular, the focus of education was liberation. Like in resistance movements, if you talk about the Zapatistas, if you talk about South African Black consciousness movement, anti-apartheid movement, we're talking about education for conscientization, right? So
Yes.
it's not just about reducing the size of educational participants, um, where it's actually like a village of people, you know, who are co-learning, but it's also about the motivations. Um, the question of discipline is an interesting one for me because I come from 1980s government education that still had the hangover of apartheid era Bantu education, like constructs, you know, and then also growing up in a household in a colored family. Discipline is enforced in quite a militaristic manner, and I think as people of color we can relate to that concept, you know, like I come from the generation where we beat obedience into people, you know, and where discipline is enforced incorrectly with the belt. Interpretation of scripture, man, you know, where people are talking about spare the rod and spoil the child, where actually the shepherd, whom we drew from in Mapungubwe prototype group, the shepherd used the rod not as a device to beat the sheep, but to bring them back to the flock and to gently like redirect them. It wasn't a punitive device. That's something that we must understand. And it's taken me 44 years to unlearn a lot of that. Um, but I think the concept of discipline must must be redirected to harnessing of agency and personal fortitude. Um, I think something that we need to learn is that opportunities many times are dressed up in ugly clothes, in the clothes of an overall, you know. Opportunities are sometimes dressed up in rags, um, where they don't perhaps have on the Yeezys or the Vomeros, you know, or the Comme des Garçons or the Balenciagas, you know, they
You're
sometimes
talking,
have on the,
you're talking the language. You're
yeah, I mean,
talking.
sometimes opportunities have on the 150 Rand Mr. Price specials, you know, and um, we need to have a longer term view of things. And I think maybe that's also an issue that's exacerbated by technology and this expectation for answers and results to produce themselves quickly. Um, that there needs to be a patience that we learn and the willingness to learn from experiences in a way that we don't rob ourselves of opportunities. Tenacity is perhaps, you know, tenacity, resilience, endurance. You know, those qualities produce, you know, that personal fortitude. Um, and the problem is that nobody can give you endurance, nobody can give you personal fortitude, qualities that are produced um, through the human problem solving, um, you know, efforts within trials and hard times. They're going to come. It's part of life, you know, no matter which form of discourse you follow, no matter which book you read, that uh, trial is going to be part, the passage through fire is going to be part of developing success or any sort of accumulation of knowledge that hopefully culminates in wisdom of some, God's sake, for some sort, you know. Um, so yeah, I think it also involves incredible humility. And hopefully on the other side, you know, there's something worthwhile. Yeah. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it definitely answers my question. And I think the last question I would like to ask you is the value of paperwork and how you get it right. Because, you know, artists come and go. We don't have a recollection of like what they were creating, where they were going. Some of them get lost in the process also because they were not sort of documenting things as they came and went. Some of them lose out on opportunities, on funding opportunities, because there's no track record of someone building something. And you know, as a senior, you know, project manager, more than a teacher, an educator, and a facilitator, you know, you had to sit with records and make sure that the numbers made sense, that things moved where they were supposed to move, you know, that there were processes and systems where people needed to be accountable, and for everyone to know where we're moving, and that to be recorded. Like
Yeah.
how pass that baton. How are you giving that to us?
Oh, so my knowledge in handling paperwork was very hard one. I suffered through 11 years of working in the banking environment, but I don't believe that everybody in this day and age needs to go through that same like like torture. I don't think anybody needs to serve that sentence in the year 2025. I think that what people younger than yourself fail to understand is that this device is a supercomputer, and yeah, it can either be a distraction or it can be a tool. And we have tools that allow us to record things, but also allow us to access knowledge and education at a speed and fluidity with which we've never been able to. I've been fond of the library as a place for learning for many years, as a democratized form of accessing knowledge. But libraries, they still form an important role, but I think that this one supersedes the library. This is more powerful than the library. I think that there are platforms for online courses such as, the Coursera's, the Udemy's, the Khan Academy, even YouTube. One can learn project management on YouTube. One can learn Excel on YouTube. One can learn Word on YouTube. But it needs to be accompanied with a thirst for knowledge, um, an absolute like aggressive desire to accumulate knowledge, and that curiosity that you've referred to once again. I think that's the most important thing. And the cost of data, it might be accessible to some, but for those who are unable to access digital knowledge, there are other forms as well. I think that non-profits these days are also performing quite an important role in offering maybe Excel classes in the hood for school leavers, who didn't do so well. And there are no rules around that. I think what helps is for us to be willing and humble enough to go and have the conversation and say, yo, I don't fit the criteria of your program, but can I maybe sit in the background, or maybe can I help you with like the donkey work or driving or taking pictures in your workshop, and we exchange, the concept of bartering. Can I make an exchange for this knowledge? Here's my skill. I have this viable skill. Can I exchange that for 2 hours in your workshop and sit down and learn these skills? And even if those forums don't exist, there might be internships that, yes, to an extent, they are exploitative in that they don't offer a rand value in compensation. But I think maybe for people younger than us, those internships would play an important role in helping us to gain critical skills, in accepting that there is a cost we have to pay. There's a barrier of access, but beyond that barrier of access, there's a knowledge that we get hold of. And to connect those real world forums for education um, with the digital and technological forms of education, which is something that people like Siviwe in our organization are also very, very passionate about, is helping us to strike a balance between the integration of real world educational structures with the fact that actually we do need to keep up with technology to some extent. Beyond that, also, I think that those of us who are working jobs in organizations that we don't really want to work, we want to be in a creative industry, but instead we're working in a corporate environment. We need to think about um, how we harness the resources within those organizations. And if they aren't, let me rephrase. I think that within corporate organizations, as problematic as some people are, what we do need to see them as is sources of some type of knowledge. and to harness that within the structures of the corporate organization, think about how do I create benefits for myself on the job benefits that don't exist by being proactive and thinking, what can I learn from this manager? This manager just finished this course. Can I congratulate them on this course and make them more amenable to teaching me, to teaching me about what they just learned and then run with that? Yeah, finding ways to harness mentorships in like a fast-paced world is another way to learn those skills. They can be learned. Um, these are ways that I taught myself or learned to learn is being like really keen on finding the resources. And my last comment on this is that um, I went into university on a recognition of prior learning program, which means that I don't have an undergrad. I accessed education through alternative sources of knowledge. And this is why I'm so passionate about forms of education that happen on the ground. Um, Teaching myself how to photograph things or how to be a photographer is things that I learned from salesmen who were in stores, selling cameras over the counter. Those guys are knowledge holders. They taught me about apertures and shutter speeds and light meters, rule of thirds. Those were the guys that taught me. But they also passed on, okay, Scott, you're too much now. Go and read this magazine in the library, like on photography or digital photography, or read Susan Sontag, you know. And also, years ago, I was thinking very progressively about online forms of education, and I accessed MIT MIT curricula online. So what MIT would do years ago, like in the 90s, is that they wouldn't give you the book, but what they would do is give you the list of readings. And I understood from a very early age that I would need to deconstruct that list for my own curriculum from things I could access in the library and mentors and other ways. Um, yeah, and I think that in this day and age, it's a lot easier for one to construct your curriculum through curiosity, navigation, and a mixture of tangible and online resources.
Thank you for sharing the knowledge.